We are continuing our study in the life of Elisha the prophet, and this is part 5, which I have titled The Shunammite Family. Most times, this story, the events that we're going to read about today, refers to the Shunammite woman, but really it was a whole family at issue here. Turn with me in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4. If you were here last week, I said we've skipped over this situation in Elisha's life when I was talking about the miracles. Now we catch back up. 2 Kings chapter 4, starting with verse 8. I'm going to be reading from the Message translation today. One day, Elisha passed through Shunem. A leading lady of the town talked him into stopping for a meal. And then it became his custom. Whenever he passed through, he stopped by for a meal. Bachelors love free meals. And Elisha was no different. "I'm certain," said the woman to her husband, "that this man who stops by with us all the time is a holy man of God. Why don't we add on a small room upstairs and furnish it with a bed and a desk, a chair and a lamp, so that when he comes by, he can stay with us?" And so it happened that the next time Elisha came by, he went to the room and lay down for a nap. Then he said to his servant Gehazi, "Tell the Shunammite woman I want to see her." He called her and she came to him. Through Gehazi, Elisha said, "You've gone far beyond the call of duty in taking care of us. What can we do for you? Do you have a request we can bring to the king or to the commander of the army?" She replied, "Nothing. I'm secure and satisfied with my family." Elisha conferred with Gehazi. "There's got to be something we can do for her, but what?" Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is an old man." "Call her in," said Elisha. He called her, and she stood at the open door. Elisha said to her, "This time next year, you're going to be nursing an infant son." "Oh, my master, oh, holy man," she said, "don't play games with me, teasing me with such fantasies." But the woman conceived. A year later, just as Elisha had said, she had a son. The child grew up. One day he went to his father, who was working with the harvest hands, complaining, "My head, my head." His father ordered a servant, "Carry him to his mother." The servant took him in his arms and carried him to his mother. She lay on her lap until noon and died. She took him up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut him in alone, and left. She then called her husband, "Get me a servant and a donkey so that I can go to the holy man. I'll be back as soon as I can." "But why today? This isn't a holy day. It's neither new moon or Sabbath." She said, "Don't ask questions. I need to go right now. Trust me." She went ahead and saddled the donkey, ordering her servant, "Take the lead and go as fast as you can. I'll tell you if you're going too fast." And off she went. She came to the holy man at Mount Carmel. The holy man, Elisha, spotting her while she was still a long way off, said to his servant Gehazi, "Look out there. Why, it's the Shunammite woman. Quickly now, ask her, is something wrong? Are you all right? Your husband and your child?" She said, "Everything's fine." But when she reached the holy man at the mountain, she threw herself at his feet and held tightly to him. Gehazi came up to pull her away, but the holy man said, "Leave her alone. Can't you see that she is in distress? But God hasn't let me in on why. I'm completely in the dark." Then she spoke up. "Did I ask for a son, master? Didn't I tell you, don't tease me with false hope?" He ordered Gehazi, "Don't lose a minute. Grab my staff and run as fast as you can. If you meet anyone, don't even take time to greet them. And if anyone greets you, don't even answer. Lay my staff across the boy's face." The boy's mother said, "As surely as God lives and you live, you're not leaving me behind." And so Gehazi let her take the lead and followed behind. But Gehazi arrived first and laid the staff across the boy's face. But there was no sound, no sign of life. Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and said, "The boy hasn't stirred." Elisha entered the house and found the boy stretched out on the bed dead. He went into the room and locked the door, just the two of them in the room, and prayed to God. He then got into bed with the boy and covered him in his body, mouth on mouth, eyes on eyes, hands on hands. As he stretched out over him like that, the boy's body became warm. Elisha got up and paced back and forth in the room. Then he went back and stretched himself upon the boy again. The boy started sneezing. 7 times he sneezed and opened his eyes. He called Gehazi and said, "Get the Shunammite woman in here." He called her and she came in. Elijah said, "Embrace your son." She fell at Elisha's feet, faced the ground in reverent awe. Then she embraced her son and went out with him. Dear God, I thank you again for your word. I pray you would help us learn from this passage in the life of Elisha, this life and death situation. Help us learn from it. In Jesus' name, amen. Like Samuel the prophet and Elijah the prophet before him, Elisha traveled a circuit around the northern kingdom of Israel, meeting with companies of prophets that we've talked about before, politicians and other people. The events described in today's passage took place at a town called Shunammite, which is about 50 miles north and a little west of Gilgal, which was Elisha's home base as much as anything was. Well, Elisha, on one of his trips around the circuit, ran into a woman at Shunammite who invited him in for dinner. That's a pretty common thing in the Middle East. Middle Eastern hospitality is famous. You invite strangers to have dinner with you. And I have had the privilege of doing that with Israelis myself in recent years. And it is a special, wonderful time when you get to share a meal with them. After that, like I said, being a bachelor, he stopped by and ate with him whenever he came to Shunammite. Although the text doesn't tell us, there was likely another company of prophets at Shunammite because he kept coming there and stopping every so often. After a while of serving dinner to Elisha, this woman had a talk with her husband. And when my wife would have a talk with me, it often was just like this. Jolene had lots of ideas, and they inevitably meant work for me. She proposed we should build a room on our roof, a guest room, for Elisha to stay in whenever he comes in town. It's actually a pretty amazing act of hospitality if you think about it. How many of us would build another room just for somebody that we have dinner with once in a while? But that's what they did. She came up with this idea, and she and their family, her husband, they built a room on top of the roof for Elisha to stay in. Well, on one of his trips to Shunammite, Elisha went up to his room to rest after he arrived. Perhaps just before dinner, he decided to take a nap. But, sometimes when you lay down and take a nap, you can't quite go to sleep. And he's thinking, this is a nice room. I really like this. We ought to do something for the lady who came up with this idea and the lady who feeds me. Such hospitality as they have given us should be rewarded. So he ordered his servant, Gehazi, to go fetch the woman. And it appears from the text that she appeared out of sight outside Elisha's room. For reasons that are not clear to me, Elisha made Gehazi act as the communication intermediary between himself and this woman. Perhaps this was out of propriety. He didn't want a woman in his room. Perhaps Elisha just didn't like to deal with people sometimes. maybe especially after he'd been traveling. His interaction with Naaman, the Aramean general that we will talk about next week, kind of suggests that he was like this sometimes. He just didn't want to deal with people. We don't know. Well, Elisha first asked her if she needed help with the king or the commander of the army. He felt like he had some political clout after the war with Moab we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And he might as well put it to use. If this family needs something, he can put in a good word with the king or the commander of the army. But her reply was, I have a home among my own people. It indicates a certain amount of contentment, or at least acceptance of her life as it was, and that she didn't need any political favors. What's funny, though, is that we will see in a few weeks that she did need a political favor after this at a later date. After the woman said, yeah, I don't need anything, you're welcome, Elisha and Gehazi spoke privately. And Gehazi said, they don't have any children. And for Elisha, bing, that's like a light bulb going up. Elisha was obviously a bachelor because this had not occurred to him that this woman had no children. That was a terrible disgrace in the Middle East at the time of Elisha. And it is still a terrible disgrace in the Middle East today. On my very first trip to Israel, I got to meet the Nazarene pastor and his wife at Nazareth at that time. It was at Haifa. It was at Haifa at that time. And she was pregnant. I mean, big. Almost due. And she had not been able to have children, and she was so excited and so wound up because her shame was now taken away. She was going to have a baby. It's a huge deal in the Middle East. If a woman is barren, she's considered to be cursed by God. And she's shunned by all the other women because she can't bear children. But, like a husband in a Hallmark shop wandering aimlessly, suddenly you find the perfect card. And this is the perfect gift for somebody who has given us such great hospitality. A kid. God says children are a gift from the Lord. So Elisha had Gehazi call her again, and now she stood in the doorway without entering his room, but in the doorway. And then Elijah drops this bombshell on her. Oh, by the way, a year from now, you'll have a baby in your arms. Now, her husband is old, and she is probably old. So this is a big surprise. Not only that, these are almost the exact same words that God spoke to Abraham. About this time next year, Sarah will have a son. And I am certain that this woman knew the scriptures and she recognized those words. A year from now, you will have a son. And lo and behold, guess what? Elisha's back a year later, and she's got a baby, a son, just as he had prophesied. That's a wonderful story with a happy ending, right? This family, this Shunammite family has a son. Their shame is gone. Wonderful kid. They're happy. Happy ending. Well, unfortunately, real life doesn't always have happy endings, right? A few years later, the boy's growing up, maybe 6, 8 years old. He's out with his father with the harvesters in the fields. I saw yesterday that they're cutting the wheat over up on top of the plateau now. And that's what was going on here. The reapers are reaping the family fields. The father's out there overseeing. The boy is watching things. Small boys love to watch heavy equipment and people working. I am just like that. I got to watch electrical people working on power poles in front of our house one time when I was about that age. And everybody loves when the street cleaner goes by. At least every boy loves that. Or when a fire engine goes by. We just love to watch stuff like that. So this is a absolutely typical family situation. The boy's out with his father watching the workers as they're reaping the harvest. And then he starts complaining, "Oh, Dad, my head hurts. Ugh." Now the father says to one of his servants, "Take him to his mother right away." So he loads him up in his arms and takes him to his mother. And she holds him in her lap. And at noon, he died. In Israel, the wheat and the barley harvest is in April or May. And this text doesn't say what they were harvesting, but it does call them reapers, which suggests that it's grain. And I've been to Israel a lot of times for business and on a couple of trips. And it gets hot in Israel in the summer and in the spring. Bev, you were there in the fall. Was it hot even then? Dina, was it hot? Yeah. It's even hotter in the summer, let me tell you. I've been there. One of the symptoms of heat stroke or hyperthermia is a headache. Your brain is literally getting baked because it's too hot and you've not drunk enough water. Heat stroke or sunstroke, that's called. That's likely what happened to this boy. And it can be fatal. Even today, people die of heat stroke. When I was down at the Grand Canyon this summer, I bought a book about fatalities in the Grand Canyon, and there are a lot of people who have gone down the trail and not taken enough water or wandered off the trail and they've died of heat stroke. It just gets too hot and you're dehydrated and your brain bakes. Well, imagine you're a mother with your firstborn son, your only kid, the one who was a miracle, and he's in your lap and he just kind of fades away and he dies. Can you imagine the shock that she felt as a mother whose son has just died in her lap? Have any of you lost a child like that? Juanita, was it hard? Okay. Yeah, it's hard. I've not lost a child, but I've lost a wife, and that's hard. I know that. This woman, however, instead of just collapsing from grief, put a desperate plan of action into place. First, she carried her son up to Elijah's room and laid him on the bed, closed the door, and left him in there. And then she told her husband, "I need a donkey now," without telling him why. Of course, he wondered out loud, why do you need a donkey and a servant right now? And why are you going to see the man of God, Elisha? Because it's not a religious festival day or a Sabbath day. But he complied with her request, supplied her with a donkey right away and a servant to lead the donkey, and they were off. Somehow she knew Elisha would be at Mount Carmel, which is about 18 miles away. And she went as fast as she could to meet him. 18 miles walking is a pretty good walk. 4 or 5 hours. On a donkey or horse, it would be less. But it's some time. Elisha and Gehazi saw her in the distance approaching, recognized her, and Elisha sent Gehazi to meet her. But all she said to the servant was the untrue statement, everything is all right. Everything is not all right, but she doesn't want to deal with the servant. She wants to talk to Elisha directly herself. And as soon as she walked up to or rode up to Elisha on the donkey, she got off her donkey, bowed down to the ground, fell flat, and grabbed him by the feet. This is a sign of absolute dependence and absolute desperation. Interestingly enough, God did not reveal the cause of her distress, what Elisha called bitter distress, which he apparently found unusual because he remarked on it. God hasn't told me what's going on. He's hiding from me what's going on. Well, as soon as she choked out the words, "Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Elisha went into action. He gave his staff, a symbol of authority from the time of Moses or even before, to Gehazi, and told him to run like the wind, not stopping for anyone or anything. Run to the boy and lay the staff on him. And then Elisha and the woman followed a little more slowly. And the mission of the hapless Gehazi was unsuccessful. Nothing happened when he laid the staff on the boy. Gehazi kind of acts as a foil to Elisha in many of these events that we read about. Gehazi was the one who cooked the stew that got poisoned. Gehazi is the one who has to go back and forth talking to the woman. Gehazi is the one that has to run all the way back with Elisha's staff and lay it on the boy. And then nothing happened. So he's kind of acts as the foil or the counterpoint to Elisha. But we can't be hard on Gehazi. He's doing the best that he can. It's just that he kind of gets the dirty jobs. Now, some commentators have pointed out that if nothing else, the staff may have prevented from anybody else burying the body if they happen to run across it, because that would be an indication that it belongs to somebody and don't touch. Well, Gehazi turned around and met them on their way back, huffing and puffing, and he said nothing happened. So then Elisha went up to the room alone. He shut the door and he prayed. The first thing Elisha did in this situation was pray. Now, I want to tell you, this boy had been there some hours, 18 miles out and 18 miles back. 5, 6, 8, 10 hours, who knows? The boy's been there dead. He's been there dead enough, long enough to be cold. Stone cold dead. After praying for a while, Elisha then pressed himself up against the body to warm it up. After a break of walking around and stretching, and he laid down again to warm up the body. And this time, the kid sneezed 7 times, and then he opened his eyes. Then Elisha called Gehazi again to call the boy's mother and reunited him. And now we come to the happy ending of this story. This woman has received her son back alive. He had been dead somewhere between 6 and 10 hours from heat stroke, and now he was back. And she was so grateful. So what do we do with this miracle, this raising of a dead son? First of all, we have to recognize that this boy truly was dead. He was not just passed out. He had lain on Elisha's bed for 8 to 10 hours, and he was totally cold, stone dead cold when Elisha reached him. This is not like CPR when somebody collapses and has a heart attack, and they thump him on the heart, and maybe they shock him with a defibrillator. This was a body that had been dead for hours and was cold. They knew he was dead. Everybody knew he was dead, and he really was dead. Jesus himself would raise 3 people from the dead as recorded in the Gospels. There may have been more that were not recorded. 2 of them were children, just like this son. There was the daughter of the synagogue leader Jairus and the son of an unnamed widow in the town of Nain. Jesus ran across the widow and the son as they were carrying the body out to bury it. But Jesus, who was fully God and fully man, had authority over life and death. Elisha, the prophet, served that same God who has authority over life and death. Now, we must understand very clearly that God's power enabled every miracle in the Bible. including the 9 or so raisings of the dead that are recorded in the Old and the New Testament together. None of the people like Elisha, Elijah, Peter, or Paul had in themselves any virtue or power to raise the dead or to perform any other miracle. And Peter especially made that clear every time he did something. Why do you look at me like I did this? God gets all the credit for miracles. They are a contravention of the laws of nature that he himself set into motion at the creation. So now we come to a really tough problem. Why do we have to lose our loved ones? Why don't we get to be like the 9 or so families that received their dead back, as recorded in the Bible? Why don't we get to have our loved ones healed before they die in the first place? Like however many uncountable families did, especially during the ministry of Jesus on earth. He healed a lot of people who were dying of fatal diseases. He raised the dead, at least 3 people recorded in the Gospels. But how come we don't get that? Why didn't God heal Jolene? Why didn't God heal Larry Curtis? Why didn't God heal Juanita, your child? Well, the writer of the letter to Hebrews, who is probably Paul the Apostle, mentioned 2 women. Well, he mentioned women who received their dead in the Old Testament. And 2 of those were the son of the widow that Elijah the prophet healed, and the son of the Shunammite woman that Elisha brought back from the dead. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35, it says, by faith, women received back their dead, raised to life again. But that very same verse in Hebrews is the transition from those who did great things by faith to those who suffered great things, including martyrdom, by faith. So that's the answer to our problem. We live in a fallen world, and we are all under the curse of physical death that we inherited from Adam and Eve. Hebrews 9:27 tells us we are all destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. The general rule is that we are all subject to the laws of nature, including disease and death. But God, in his sovereign will and for his own purposes, occasionally contravenes his laws of nature. And that is why Jolene died, because God did not choose to contravene his laws of nature in her situation, because that it was his sovereign will for his purposes. Death is not the worst thing that can happen. In recent years, I've had about 6 of my extended family suffer from dementia and or Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a disease that kills people 2 at a time, the patient and the caregiver. Death is not the worst thing that can happen. We grieve our own loss, and we celebrate when God does choose to intervene. Either way, he is in control. And he has told us that we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.